Today we're going to be talking about engineering and computer science reports. And just as a little bit of an introduction, my name is Vivian and I'm from Academic Skills. I'd like to also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm joining you from today, and for any of those of you in other states in Australia, extend that acknowledgement to the peoples in your areas too. Here in Canberra, the First Nations people are the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri peoples, so I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and again extend that respect out to other areas of Australia from which you're joining me today. In today's session, do feel free to write in the chat. I am a little bit confused because I'm not seeing any messages so far, so this is my very first time doing a webinar in this format. So if you have any questions about using the chat, I assume that you'll be able to use the chat fine. But if you have any questions, do feel free to do things like raise your hand. Fantastic, thank you. I've got somebody saying that they're in Canberra studying advanced computing. Wonderful. Good to see that the chat's active. So do feel free to pop in questions, comments, thoughts in the chat as we go along. This is going to be about a 50-minute, 55-minute session. Now, I said that I'm Vivian from Academic Skills. I'll just explain a little bit about what we do. Thank you. I've got somebody who came for the presentations workshop earlier on today. Fantastic. Lovely to see you again. We help students with their writing, and this also applies to engineering and computer science. You're going to be writing reports, for instance, in engineering and computer science, and you might also be doing things like reflective writing, which my colleague Gillian is talking about. She did one session earlier today. She's also doing another session later this week about reflective writing, so that's something that you might like to go along to hear more about. Today is a workshop like we do around this time every year, where we give you a bit of an overview of what's involved in the major pieces of assessment and study skills that you'll need to use at ANU. But you can also come and see us for individual appointments. So if you ever have a report that you are writing and you want to get some feedback on it before you submit it to your lecturer, you can actually make an appointment to come and see us. And I'll just pop the link to that booking system, that online booking system, so it's nice and easy to book in here. So it's in the chat there, and you can check out our webpage. Also, so that you're aware, we have a whole heap of website resources, including short videos about these topics, report writing and so on our website. So I've just posted in the web page about report writing. In that page, there are also sub pages where they go through the individual steps of writing reports. Okay, and so thank you. Somebody's let me know that the link to the report writing hasn't come through the chat, which is a bit funny. I've got it to all panelists. Okay, thank you for letting me know that. So I'll just post those links again. Fantastic, that's really awesome. Thank you for telling me. So all panelists and attendees, great. So that link there is the appointments link if you want to ever book an appointment, and to report writing. So let's get started. Now, in KEX reports, like I said, you can come and see us. Report writing might be something that you're used to. You might have done a whole heap of reports in the past, or it might be something that you're completely new to. It might also be that reports at ANU might look different to the kinds of reports that you've done in the past. So I highly recommend do come to see us for feedback and see us before you actually submit your first one, just to check that you're on the right track. Your lecturers will give you fantastic, really nice and clear instructions, and we can help to show you whether you're following those instructions really nice and carefully. What I'd suggest is that you actually come and see us about a week or maybe even 2 weeks before it is due. We do get booked up through the semester. We're a very popular service. We do see about 2,000, 2,500 people per year in appointments. So do book in to come and see us. So you can do that in 3 different ways. You can just drop in just to ask quick questions, 5-10 minute questions with the peer writers who are going to be starting in week 3 of this semester, where they're going to be running from 11 o'clock till 1 o'clock each day in the Chifley Library. So you can just head along to the Chifley Library. They're in the main kind of foyer area, and you can ask them quick questions about any kind of study related matter on those days. Writing coaches do half-hour appointments, and learning advisors do 45-minute appointments. Writing coaches will view your work on the spot, give you feedback on the spot about your work. Learning advisors, you submit your work beforehand, we read it and we give you feedback. So depending on how complex your topic is, I highly recommend you do come and see us in a variety of ways. Alrighty, so my main message today is that a key message is really vital to your report. So those of you who are in presentations, same thing, key message, it's really important. You're writing a report to be able to make some kind of main idea or point or recommendation to your reader about the topic that you're talking about. So reports are not just descriptive, you have to actually show what your answer is to that main question that you're being asked. So really a report means that you have to take a position and possibly provide a solution to the problem that you're being set. And you need to back that up then with the clear reasons for your solution. So a report then is a persuasive piece of writing. So you need to persuade your readers why your solution is the most logical solution to take. So just to go over the kinds of reports that you might have, if you're in engineering and computer science, if you're in engineering in particular, you might be asked to do a design proposal. So you might be asked to propose a particular design. So for instance, a design of a solar panel, or a design of a solar car, or a design of a 3D printed object that you might be making. And then it gets more exciting. You might be able to do not only a design development, but also an implementation report. So when you actually make stuff, you can then write a report about how did you make it the way that you did? Why did you do it that way? And what were the results like? Was it successful? Did it follow the specifications? What are the benefits and the drawbacks of the thing that you made, the object that you made? And if you're in computer science, you'll do a similar kind of thing. So you might be applying coding to a particular problem or a particular data set. You might be looking at a particular problem in computer science. So for instance, a network problem, and you have to analyze that problem and explain why you think that the problem occurs in that way, what might be some solutions, and so on. So if you're looking at your design proposal, in engineering, your persuasive message is about why your design is going to solve that problem. And then if you've implemented that design, was it successful or not? If it was successful, why was that the best way to do it? What are the outputs that were beneficial? Why are there advantages to it? And also potentially, if there are limitations, why can you see the next steps as being the most logical next steps to take? So if it was completely unsuccessful and you're quite disappointed about it, that's okay. It's fine for your work to be something where you face many hurdles, but your report just writes about why you thought those hurdles were important, what you think could be done about them in future, why you think they impacted the work in the way that it did. And then for computer science reports, you'll be persuading the reader of why your code or why your analysis is logical, what the benefits and the disadvantages are to your particular design. So you'll be persuading the reader of why your outputs are the most logical ones and what kind of things could be done to improve it in future. All right, so really a report is going to take a few different steps. And actually when you get given a report set of instructions, you might see that they've actually laid it out in the same process as you might write it. So what I've got here on the slide is a bit of a diagram of what the report writing process might look like to you. So first of all, you'd start by breaking down the task, figuring out what to do and what your lecturer wants. And then you need to collect the information, do some analysis, gather evidence and so on. And from that, rather than start writing immediately, what you can do usually at that stage is to figure out what your key message is roughly going to be. And that's actually a really important step, particularly when it comes to group writing. So if you're doing a group report, way better to agree on the key message first before you go out and do individual pieces of writing, because otherwise it might end up with a very, very inconsistent looking report. So really meet to agree on what the task is, do some analysis, and then meet again to agree on what your key message is going to be all together before you start doing any writing. So after that, then you would structure and plan out your report and write it. And remember, good writing is writing that has been through a few different drafts. So it's been edited and polished. So you need to leave time to do that. So we're going to go through this process. So usually when you're understanding the task, you need to concentrate on, out of all of these instructions, what is it that you are trying to investigate and analyze, and what are you trying to solve? So what are you supposed to develop a key message about? So here's an engineering design report specification. And out of this one, so there's a paragraph here of information, but the thing that I see as being the key point that you're going to develop a key message in relation to is about the optimality or goodness of the final design. So this is a real example. And so your key message would all hang on this particular point. Why was your design optimal or good given the specifications, given the application and the problems that you face, and given the outputs that you have? So everything in that report is really helping to make your argument about your optimal or good design nice and clear to the reader. Same kind of thing for a computer science report. And this is what I mean by you might be asked to do things in stages or steps in computer science. So again, this is a real example. And so they outline this set of tasks to do. And the key thing that I think comes out here in terms of key message is, after devising a classification or regression problem and solving it to determine the performance of your particular neural network, the thing that you came up with, the piece of programming that you came up with, you have to implement a technique from the literature, and you need to explain the benefit or lack of benefit of that particular technique. So based on the problem that you've identified and based on your identification of solutions in Python to solve that problem and your identification of a neural network, you have to then implement a technique and figure out whether it worked or not. And so your report will all hinge on whether these steps worked or didn't work. So your key message is always going to be about, was it successful or unsuccessful? So this will be a really useful thing to go back to and to think about. And I've got a question about, is this session being recorded? So yes, this session is being recorded. The chat itself is not being recorded, so feel free to type whatever you like in there. Also, on that site that I linked to you before, that one about report writing, on there you can see short videos of this. So if, for instance, you want to remember, oh, what's that bit about the assignment instructions, for instance, there is a video just about understanding the task on the website. So you can go back to those and see them in broken up bits. The slides are also on the website too. So you can have a look back at the slides in more detail later on. Alrighty, so once you've done that kind of analysis of what is my key message likely to be, you've got to do the analysis, the actual work. So that can include a whole lot of different kinds of things. So it could involve programming, it could involve doing the work yourself, it could involve doing a lot of reading around in terms of the textbooks and the journal articles related to the particular problems that you're looking at. So there's going to be a mixture of kind of you doing the primary work and also the secondary kind of analysis of the problem through somebody else's piece of work. So yes, there's a lot of analysis types that you can do, and your lecturers will give you a little bit more detail about that in the courses themselves. Just keep in mind that if they do ask you to do secondary research, and they ask you to do extra research outside of the course materials, if they ask you to do research about the topic, there are different kinds of things that you can look at. So book chapters, journal articles, government reports, industry reports, etc. Just having a think now, which ones do you think would be most relevant to you? So given the courses that you're doing, what of these kind of things or any other sources that you think of, what do you think would be the most relevant kind? Feel free to type it in the chat. And just to clarify, yes, I will send you a recording of this session afterwards. Industry research, definitely, yeah. So particularly if you're looking at cutting edge technology, you're going to be looking at the most up-to-date kind of industry research. Think about the pros and cons of them too. Industry research might publish the highlights, they might publish what worked really well, they might not publish the experiments that failed, for example. So these kinds of sources you need to think about in terms of what do they tell me, but what do they not tell me? Where else can I find that information too? Where can I dig around to find the full picture? All right, has anyone got any other ideas of things that they might use? For instance, book chapters or chapters in a book, they can be really useful if you're doing like your early assignments and your lecturers encourage you to use your textbooks or encourage you to take on key concepts that have been talked about in textbooks quite a bit. You might look at those. Blogs from computer science researchers. Yeah, fantastic. They might be talking about up-to-date research. Again, take these all with a bit of analysis on your part in terms of thinking about how reliable they are. Make sure that the person who's writing it is actually a computer science researcher rather than somebody who doesn't know very much about the topic. So you look into who is doing the writing. And the ANU library actually has a bunch of fantastic resources about evaluating sources. So they'll help you to figure out how to assess whether this is a reliable topic or not, a reliable source of information. Journal articles, of course, are quite reliable if they're peer-reviewed because they've gone through that process of fact-checking, for instance. Now, I mentioned before that key messages are really vital. Write them out early on. So rather than just keeping it in your head and thinking about it in your head, write it out on a piece of paper or in a file before you start writing. Because particularly if you're working in a group, you can all go back to that key message, remember it, and that will shape your writing. So that key message is going to influence how you write the other sections of the paper. And it might change along the way. If you're writing in a group, remember to talk with each other before you make any major changes. Now, here's an example of a key message. We propose an adaptive coefficient setting method for 2-hop relay protocol and analyze it in comparison with the Metropolis method for nearest neighbor protocol. The simulation shows that there is a significant improvement on the consensus speed. Thus, the coefficient setting method can be more efficiently used in these applications. So which part of this do you think is the most exciting bit of the key message? Which bit tells you what that key message really is? What do you pull out of that as being the key message, do you think? And this is from an ANU student. So this is a piece of writing that a student has published in the undergraduate research journal. Significant improvement on the consensus speed. Yes, fantastic. Thank you. I agree. I think that's the key message in this one too. So I've really kind of highlighted here that their key message is about their simulation, showing that there is a significant improvement. Their key message can also be about the recommendations, that it can be more efficiently used in these applications. Yeah, so that key message stands out really nice and clearly. That kind of key message you would expect to see in the introduction. I actually took this from the introduction or the abstract, or both. So this is actually in the introduction. So here we come to, well, how do you actually structure the report? Now, generally, reports will have these kinds of sections. So this is really rough kind of general report structure where you'll have a title page, contents, executive summary, introduction, etc. Note that the references come before the appendices, and do ask your lecturers about whether they accept appendices or not. Some people will say yes, some people will say no. It'll all depend on the page count or the word count in your courses. Now, the discussion section is the most flexible part of the whole thing. So this is where you've really got to decide on how you have to structure that part. So we'll talk about that in a sec. Basically, when you think about your report structure as kind of introduction, discussion, conclusion, you can think of it similar to a scientific report. So if you've done kind of experimental reports before, where the introduction sets out why you looked at it, then you've got sections on how you looked at it, what you found, and then why those findings are meaningful. In computer science and engineering, ask your lecturers whether they want you to separate the methodology from the results in the discussion, and whether they want you to separate the results from the discussion. Some people will say different things, so do check with your lecturer. So often in computer science and engineering journal articles, if you read those in your courses, you will notice that actually the results and discussions are combined, and they do include a lot of the methodology. So have a think about what's expected in your course and ask your lecturer. Generally though, you're going to be explaining in kind of roughly this order why you did it, how you did it, what you found, and why it's meaningful. It's just that maybe you did a few different stages. So it might be that you repeat this multiple times within the discussion section, if that makes sense. So here's an example of a real report structure. So this is just taking the headings from a design report structure. So after the introduction, it had the analysis of the problem and the requirements, so kind of setting out the specifications, or the specs, as I'm calling them. Then analysis of the design ideas and decisions, and then the design proposal or recommendation. So actually these parts were the most lengthy parts of the whole report, because this is where the students' analysis came in. So think about, when you're organising the body of your report, what your major points are and what subsections fit within those points. And for each of those sections, then break it into subsections again, or dot points again, because those are likely to become your paragraphs. And if you've got multiple subsections within a whole report, you might need little kind of sentences or a couple of sentences at the start to say, this section is about this stage of the project. You might even need a summary section, a summary sentence or two at the end of that section to say, so in this section, we've found that this design protocol worked in this way. However, there were problems, so we tested out a new method. Next section, here's the new method or the next method that we tested out. So you can be quite flexible. So do ask your lecturer about whether they have any specifications that they want you to follow. Otherwise, you can come and talk to us about it. So here's another example report where you can see they've got a section on theoretical background, then the hypothesis and the method section, then the results are their own section, and analysis is its own section, and then the discussion as well. So this is a pretty standard kind of report structure that you see in engineering. And then in computer science, you have something similar, but the discussion on consensus protocol is like the kind of discussion of what's the problem. Preliminaries is where you set out the math, really. So setting out what's the theory that you're going to use, then here's the problem, your proposal for what you're going to do, your simulation results first, and then your discussion, potentially application results. For instance, this one didn't have any, but they had a discussion instead, and then the conclusion. So it can be quite flexible, and these headings are actually the headings that the student used, so you can be quite flexible in your headings too. So really the structure needs to support your key message. So there has to be a logical sequence of ideas that supports your key message, and that narrative needs to be persuasive. So it needs to show us, how did you solve that problem? Why was that the best solution? Or why, when you face problems, do you think that these are the reasons why you face those problems? So every part of the report has a purpose that ties back to that key message of why were you successful or unsuccessful? And each paragraph also supports that. So we're going to look at paragraphs in a sec. Now, when you write the paper, if you've seen this hourglass kind of image before of essays or other kinds of pieces of writing, the same kind of principle applies for KEX reports, where you introduce the topic with a bit of background information, just a few sentences, not heaps of paragraphs, but actually just a few sentences, just to let the reader understand what is this general topic about, and then you get more specific until you get to the point of what is your project going to do. So this introductory section might only take a paragraph, or it might take a couple of paragraphs if it's a longer report. But really within one paragraph or 150 to 200 words, you go from what is the topic about, what's the problem, what is your report going to do, what's your solution, what's your key message. And then the sections of the report make up the body, and then your conclusion goes into what did you do, and then why is that important. So we're going to go through each of these sections. Now, in a KEX report, you might be asked to write an executive summary as well as an introduction, or you might be asked to do an executive summary or an introduction. Now, there are slight differences between them. Basically, they both provide an overview of what you're going to do, but the differences between them is that the executive summary can focus a bit more on the implementation and the recommendations. So it can focus more on what did you actually do and find in a lot of details and what your recommendations are. So it's really an overview of each of the key elements of the report. And an executive summary, if you think of it like if you're going out into the industry world, for instance, if you're pitching an idea for a piece of technology, you would be presenting a business case. And so you would be giving your potential client this executive summary of why your proposal works, or why your product works, why your piece of technology works. And so the executive summary covers that. Now, if you're working for government, for instance, or for industry, where your program hasn't, for instance, been successful, you'll be talking about why it was and wasn't successful. So what worked, what didn't, etc. So the point is, in these topics at university, be honest, be forthcoming about the challenges that you faced, as well as highlighting the things that did work. So be honest, and remember that it's all about showing your analysis. Your markers really want to see that you can analyze the problem logically and that you can identify solutions to those problems. So that's what they want to see. So your executive summary provides that key message really clearly about what did you find, why was it important. The introduction sets up what the problem's going to be, and it explains why it's important, and it explains how you're going to address it in the report. So an introduction is a bit more of an insight into, well, what are you going to do about it, but you might not necessarily talk about the results in as much detail. Okay, so executive summaries provide that overview, and they typically include these 4 parts. So outline of the context and the aim, outline of the findings, the key message, and the recommendations. They might also include the methodology. So we're going to look at an example. Sorry for the amount of text that's on this slide, but I'm going to step you through these parts. So here is an example of a real executive summary. So in the first part, they're providing context about Power Blocks, which is a particular initiative that they've been working on in this course. And so they're saying, well, Power Blocks, the thing that they have produced, is really useful, basically. And they're saying, why is it useful for electronics, and why is there, in this case, kind of business idea, this pitching this piece of technology as a business idea, going to be something that's successful. Then what they do is they tell us really clearly what their aim is. So our product is composed of, so they're telling us what their product is like, and then they're telling us who their product helps, or who Power Blocks is aimed at, what their audience is like, or what their target market is like. And so they're telling us, okay, here's why this product is really valuable, who it helps. And then they go through the approach that they use. So in this case, like a business kind of business case, they're telling us how they're going to promote the product, how they're going to make the product work, and then their key findings here. So they're forecasting how the Power Blocks technology is going to benefit the electronics industry. So then they give their recommendations at the end, and notice that they actually tell us their recommendations here. They don't just say that we're going to give recommendations, they actually tell us what they are. So what they do, for instance, down here is tell us that it is a sound opportunity for investments. So that's what an executive summary looks like. An introduction is quite similar. So background and context, aim and limitations, as well as the scope, and the statement of your key message. And then perhaps a little bit differently than the executive summary, it outlines the report structure. But notice that, for instance, the key message might not necessarily include the findings in as much detail as the executive summary. So we're going to look at this example. So they first of all give broad context for this consensus problem. So this is the same topic as we looked at before in the computer science key message. So they're talking about consensus problems in general, why those problems matter, so how they apply to different disciplines, and then they give a narrower context to talk about the consensus protocol. And they talk about distributed methods, which then raises their question about what they're going to do about distributed methods. So their aims then emerge as investigating the consensus protocol. And notice here how they've got this outline of the report structure. So firstly, we outline preliminary knowledge. Secondly, we do this, etc. And that outline of the report structure can really help when you've got a long report. So it helps your reader or your marker to know what's coming next. Then they talk about what they did. So what the implementation was like, what their aims are, and at the same time, they're outlining the report structure. They're continuing to do that. So you'll see again these kinds of signposts. Firstly, secondly, thirdly, and notice too, this is a group report, or it's written in first person, in other words. So that's completely fine. In this particular case, if you're worried about whether you can use first person or not, ask your lecturer. Some lecturers might have particular recommendations. We see a lot of first person writing in engineering and computer science because it's your project, or if you're working in a group, it's your project in the plural, we did this. So that's fine. Now, in their key message here, they're talking about what their results were. So the effect of this network, etc., works in this way. So the investigation of the two-hop relay showed their protocol performance, and then they talk about what their simulations result in. Now, at the end there, they've got last week include our project with some future research directions. You could potentially be a little bit more specific there and say the future recommendations of these and these, if you wanted to. But basically what they do at the end of this introduction is to recap the aims and the contribution to the field. So again, why does it matter? So because that was quite a long introduction for a longish report, and they quite nicely stepped you through those different moves of an introduction, they then feel like it's good to then wrap it up by reminding the reader what they did. So not just ending on what can future research do, which kind of puts the emphasis on what other people could do. Instead, they bring it back to what they can do, what their project actually achieved. So this actually reminds us, why is this an important contribution to the field? So it follows a really nice structure. Now, you might be wondering too about where does that research in terms of the background knowledge fit? Sometimes your lecturers will tell you they need to see a literature review. So a literature review is something that might be placed in different sections of a report. So sometimes it can be embedded in the introduction where you actually say, here's what the current state of knowledge is about the topic, and here's the gap that we are going to fill, or here's the problem that we are going to solve. And that might be done in just a few sentences, for instance, in that main kind of first paragraph or two of the introduction. But it could be its own section where, for instance, this orange triangle is meant to represent like an introduction, where you have your introduction to the whole project, covering those 4 moves of what's the context, what's the problem, what are your aims, and what's the outline of the report. And then after you've done that, then you move on to a literature review where you outline what do we know about this topic. So what's the broad kind of context about this topic, a bit of background, perhaps those preliminaries. And then you drill down into what are the gaps or the problems that you were going to address. And that way, this literature review really motivates your own work. So it motivates or shows the justification for your work. So it might then raise your aims in a bit more detail and then the approach that you're going to take. Now, in some reports, if you have a really long report, you might actually provide a little bit of a literature review, talking about what has been done before, what has not been done in the different sections. So you might find that there's relevant literature to put in the different sections. If you do, just make sure that you think about the logic of the placement really carefully, that you explain why you're presenting that literature there and how does it motivate that particular part of the report. Okay, so literature reviews are really there to help explain the motivation for your study. So it's not just a simple description of what literature exists, it's really focused on identifying what are the key problems that you are going to address. So your goal with writing a literature review is to identify those problems and issues that other scholars or other researchers are finding and provide enough background information for your readers to understand the problem and the definitions that you use to then explain where your research fits in. So it's like you're saying, okay, those people have done these experiments, but they haven't been able to figure out the cause of this. So that's why I'm going to look at it in this way. So that's why you have literature reviews. And when you have a literature review, you might be using people's words. So you might find some really good ways that people have explained the particular concept. And there are different ways to use that material. So what I suggest is that you go along to the workshop on using sources to find out a bit more, because you can write quite a bit in your own words about those concepts. Even though they look quite tricky, quite involved, you can actually show your understanding even better when you write in your own words, which is summarizing or paraphrasing or even synthesizing. Now I'm going to go over this quite quickly, so please bear with me as we do, and do feel free to ask questions in the chat as we go through the following slides. But the key thing to remember is that in engineering and computer science, most of all, you're being expected to write in your own words. It is very rare to see quotes in engineering and computer science reports. Quotes are when you quote exactly what that person said. So really your lecturers are expecting you to summarize, paraphrase, or synthesize other people's work in your own work. So you can go along to the workshop to find out a little bit more. But if we take an example here, you'll see, for example, that in this paragraph, the author is doing quite a few different things. So a summary and a paraphrase is where you write in your own words. A summary is where you're summarizing the main idea. A paraphrase is where you're taking one particular idea. So in the black here, they're summarizing what this all 2019 study found overall. Whereas in the red, they've taken particular information from these studies and they're presenting them in their own words. So these words are different to what the original says. But then note how in here there is a quote, but just very brief. So Hassanova et al. Point out that transaction patterns can be observed and it is possible to link a user identity to an address. So if, for instance, you think that expression, that exact same words that those people have used are really pertinent to the idea, if you think they're really expressed in a way that you can't get across in your own words, then you might quote it. Or if you think it's a brilliant, expression, that's when you might quote it. But most of the time, it'll be paraphrases and summaries interspersed with your own analysis. Notice too, topic sentences, which is what I'll talk about next. Your own analysis usually appears at the start of the paragraph, then interspersed throughout, and then right at the end too, where you're summarizing what that paragraph has been about. So really think of your analysis as you showing the connection between how those different pieces of information back up your key idea. So this paragraph is all about how blockchain technology has opportunities, but also has some serious limitations. So this grey text is actually helping us to understand what the limitations are and how those researchers pointed out the limitations, as well as the opportunities. So here are some of the limitations, here are some of the opportunities that it has. And so that final sentence at the end is justifying how they've shown those opportunities and limitations in blockchain technology. All right, so when you write the body of the report, each of those paragraphs have to really relate back to what's your key message about. So if you, for instance, tried an implementation, that will be about why did you try that implementation, and then what worked, what didn't work, what was the optimality or the goodness of your particular design, for example. So the body of your report is where you present the findings, like the data, for instance, that you're using, and do make sure that you discuss all your figures and tables in the paragraphs. When you're thinking about the report, usually people will find it really helpful to actually look at the figures first of all and then figure out what your key message is going to be in that section. But keep in mind that the figures and tables, they can't be interpreted very easily by the reader just by themselves. So your paragraphs need to tell the reader how they should interpret those figures and tables. So every figure and table should have some kind of explanation within the paragraphs themselves. You can't just rely on the reader to interpret those figures or tables just from the figure legends or the table headers. You have to actually write about them in your paragraphs. And you can actually use appendices in many reports, depending on what your lecturer says, to put your raw or extra data in. So if you're struggling to fit everything in and you've got that raw analysis that you've then derived a graph from, for instance, you can keep the graph in the body, but move the raw data to the appendix. Okay, so thinking about paragraphs, we just looked at one, and what I explained there about a topic sentence is really related to the fact that paragraphs are supposed to represent one main idea each. And if you think of them like a burger, paragraphs have three main parts. So there's the top bun, which is the topic sentence. So that's the main idea and the key message, how that information that's in the paragraph relates back to the key message. Then the filling of the burger is your evidence. And that can be a whole mixture of things, just like you saw in that example. And then the final bun is the concluding and linking sentence. So wrapping up, how did all of this filling stuff or evidence help to make that key message happen. Remember, paragraphs are usually quite short, so 150 to 200 words. I wish there were burgers after this session. That would be lovely. It does make me hungry, actually, this image. So if we take a look at an example, here's one from a results section. You'll see at the start, so this is your topic sentence that I've highlighted here. So we've got the main idea of this paragraph. So this paragraph is really analysing figure 1. And it ties back to their main argument or their key message. So how the second order neighbour could help increase the consensus speed. So again, optimality or goodness of the design, how can it increase the consensus speed? So it's about why was this successful? Why did it work? So your key message should really be kind of emphasised in the topic sentence. You need to think about how does this particular paragraph help me to advance that key message? All right, and then in the middle of the paragraph, you've got your evidence and analysis. So evidence might be kind of describing what figure 1 says, and the analysis shows why they think that that shows the increase of the consensus speed. All right, and then what you've got here down the end is not necessarily a concluding and linking sentence. This one is actually kind of an extra idea. So, interesting point. Not everyone uses concluding and linking sentences. If you've got a topic sentence and that's really nice and clear, fantastic. You might not even need a concluding and linking sentence. They're kind of more optional. It does make them nice and able to digest really easily. But if you've got a topic sentence, that's great. That's fantastic. That's the key thing that you need to help your reader make sense of the paragraph. What you don't want is a bun without a topic sentence. So if you had, for instance, a burger with no bun, it'd be very hard to eat just with your hands. So it'd be very hard to digest and figure out how it all fits together. So what you really want to do is make sure that if, for instance, you've written a draft and you've got that, you don't really have a topic sentence, instead you've just plunged into the evidence and the analysis. If you've got a sentence in the paragraph, it's usually towards the end that you end up writing this when you're drafting out your work, that sums up your work really nicely and explains why that paragraph relates back to your key message. Copy that, I'll cut it out and move it up to the top. Make that your topic sentence, rewrite another sentence in the kind of end bit, and then that will make it much easier for your reader to understand. Because if you, for instance, started this paragraph just with, for instance, node 1 has a second order neighbour, you'd be a little bit lost. So you really need to understand how that key message gets across. All right, so really the body or the evidence in your paragraphs can be from your own analysis, your own data, can be from the evidence of other academic sources. It'll depend on the assignment question that you're asked and what your lecturer wants. So if you think about those topic sentences and how they show the main idea of the paragraph and how it relates to your key message, this gives you a really good skeleton of what your whole report can look like. So your topic sentences are actually a really great planning tool. So before you even start writing the paragraphs in detail, what some people really like to do is just write out the topic sentences first, and then they can go back and fill in the paragraphs as they write up the drafts. So if you're doing a group report, you might actually get together and write out your topic sentences all together for each of the sections, and then go away and fill them in with a bit more detail. It'll take a bit of coordination, but I think that's a really great way of working. Conclusions can be quite short, actually. They can just summarise your key findings, talk about limitations potentially, unless you want to talk about limitations in a previous section in the discussion, that can work too. And conclusions can usually wrap up the recommendations and future directions. They could even go into a bit more detail. If, for instance, in the discussion section, you already talked about the recommendations and the future directions, that's fine too. The conclusions can just summarise them neatly. And then finally, it will talk about what's the overall significance or the implications of your work or the applications. So here's an example, where we've got, first of all, what was actually done. So what the purpose of the paper was, and then they've got their key message. So they developed this hypothesis and that the hypothesis was supported. So notice here how it's not necessarily following that exact order as what I showed on the screen here. So it depends on how you want to write it as to what you do. But basically what they're saying here is, what did you do? Why did you do it? What did you find? And then they talk about the implications and future directions, talking about future work and future steps. And then they talk about the so what, or the implications. So when you wrap up your conclusion, really ask yourself, what did I do? Why does it matter? All right. Then after you've written your conclusion, you might be really tempted just to not ever read it again. Don't do that. Make sure that you leave time to edit, because editing your work really, really improves it. And that's the thing that I think people regret most of all, is if they haven't left enough time to edit it. So really do make sure when you are working as a group or when you're working individually, give yourself at least a few days to go over that paper and edit it. So what we recommend is that you actually edit it in these 4 levels. So rather than focusing on typos, because if, for instance, you go through your report and you just fix up the tiny mistakes, like the spelling mistakes, you might have spent a few hours doing that, but then you might realize, actually, you need to cut that section. So really, what you need to do is tackle the hard stuff first. So first of all, look at your argument or your key message and think about, is the key message actually there? Do we have one? Because that is the most important thing. If you can't tell your marker what you did and what you found and why that finding is important, then they might be lost reading the whole thing. So make sure you've got that key message first of all. Then look at whether the structure actually works, whether there are bits that you need to cut, move around, expand on. So make sure that those are good. And actually, those are the things that matter the most. And your markers will actually kind of reiterate this in the marking rubrics that they use. So they will give you instructions and they will give you marking rubrics where they show you how they are going to mark it. And in the marking rubrics, it will usually outline, is there a key message and is there a good structure? And those will be weighted quite highly, as well as was the content correct. Then after you've done those, then it's time to get into the details, and that's looking at paragraphs. Do they have a topic sentence? Do they have enough evidence? Are they well structured? Are they nice and clear? And then the expression stuff. So we've got heaps more information on our website about editing your work. So I can put the link to the chat in the chat there later on. But do also take care about your presentation. So do also proofread your work too and check that the referencing is correct. Do all of those kind of proofreads through to make sure that you haven't got any mistakes, make sure that the figures are all correctly formatted and so on, and make sure that the appendices are labelled. So actually, you know, you do need to go do quite a bit of polishing up at the end. So make sure that you leave yourself that time. Now, I have mentioned it quite a few times that you might be working in groups, and if you've ever worked in a group before, you probably know that they can be quite difficult to work in because of all kinds of things. We do also have fantastic information on our website about effective group work. The key thing that we recommend is make sure that you set expectations really clearly as a group early on. The key thing that makes groups fall apart is because different people have different expectations. So one person might expect that you only need to check in once every couple of weeks, whereas another person might be expecting that everyone wants to do really well on the assignment, so they need to check in at least a couple of times a week. And you can see how that then can cause problems. So what you need to do is talk, first of all, meet regularly, talk about your expectations, talk about whether you're the kind of student who wants to do really well or whether you're the kind of student who has a lot on their plate and they just want to get through this assignment so that they can concentrate on the other things. So set those expectations early, draw up a plan of what you're going to do and set the roles that you're going to take. Who's going to manage the meeting minutes, who's going to do the reminders for the group, who's going to be the person who raises the counter arguments or the objections. Somebody could play that devil's advocate kind of role and say, but hang on, we haven't thought about this. And that will serve to strengthen your group's output. Make sure that you all work on managing the group together. Think about what are your strengths, work to those strengths, and be clear about that, talk with each other about that, and talk with each other if you're unhappy about what's happening. So reflect on what's happening and talk with each other. Also, bear in mind that you can also talk to us to get advice, talk to your tutors if you feel like things aren't progressing as you'd like, and check out our advice on group work too. So there's plenty of support available for your group work, but it's important that you reach out for help do that early before things go pear-shaped. So I hope you all have fantastic experiences in working in groups. It can be tough, but if you follow this advice and if you're diligent about communicating with each other, then you can often resolve those issues as you go, and that actually makes you a better group. So to wrap up, really consider your key message when you're breaking down the question and when you're planning out your assignment, and make sure that you structure your report to support that key message. On top of that, the writing needs to be logical and clear, follow those paragraphing conventions, make sure that you leave time to edit and proofread your work, and use those group strategies to help you get through the report. Now, like I said, you can get plenty of help. You can come and ask us questions. Peer writers are on from 11 to 1, Monday to Friday, Chipley Library from week 3. You can also come and see us for appointments. So you can check in and you can actually make group appointments. So you could actually book in, then you give us a call to say, hey, we've got multiple people coming, just so that we know that we have enough chairs, for instance, in the in-person setting, or that we send the Zoom link to everyone. And you can also come and see us for longer things too, where we'll actually read your work in advance. So if you've got a really long report, come and see us for those appointments. Now, if any of you have English as your second or third or other language, there's also conversation groups, and these can be really fantastic ways to practice working in groups to get your communication really confident, particularly, you know, if you're studying overseas at the moment. So you can join the Let's Speak English groups, and they run Monday to Friday, and they run on Zoom, and there's one session each week in person as well if you happen to be in campus. Come along to those. You don't need to register, you just head along to this website and follow the links there to get to the Zoom link. Alrighty, so that's the end of my slideshow really. This final slide is about whether you want to view more details and videos. So we do have plenty on our website, and we also have an Orientation Week Waddle site, which has the slides and handouts and things like that too, but they are also on our website. The Waddle site is more for if you have no access to YouTube, for example, you can head along there to see the videos.